All right, Jason, thanks for doing this. I think probably the best way to start is just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to do what you currently do.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I write a website called The Roots of Progress, where I write about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. I've been doing that full time for about a year and a half, almost 2 years now. Prior to that, I spent almost 20 years in the tech industry and software. My background's in computer science. I was a software engineer, engineering manager, and technology startup co-founder. Spent over a decade in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I still am. Co-founded two technology startups in that time. And then, yeah, in middle or late 2019, decided to take a kind of a turn in my career and pursue a topic that I'd become absolutely obsessed with, which was the history of technology and the history of human progress. And so now I'm kind of an independent researcher, and I research and write about that full time.
How do you think working in the tech space influenced how you think about innovation and progress?
Hmm. Well, it certainly gave me a firsthand kind of upfront view of what does it take to get something new off the ground. And how does technology evolve? I sort of watched the technology industry evolve over about 20 years, from the beginnings of the consumer internet and the web, all the way through kind of social media and smartphones, and into the current day. So I just think seeing how that evolved and kind of what was obvious to people in the in the early days of that. Where did people think things were going to go? What technologies were tried and abandoned? I think that upfront kind of view of technological evolution and business evolution was really useful. Um, yeah.
I just want to pause on that because the tried and abandoned is really interesting, particularly if you're looking historically, because typically only the winners get profiled, right? So it's like I remember a friend of mine, Alex Epstein, wrote an article exploring the evolution of the energy industry, and we think about like oil and natural gas just sort of like and coal being the sources of energy, and he talked about the way in which, particularly for oil, there's actually a ton of competitors for a long time, there were certain reasons then about that led oil to win out, and those are helpful to know in order to judge a technology today, that it actually has certain features that make it superior and that weren't obvious to people at the beginning. It wasn't obvious that this is going to be the winner, and I think that's one of the things that is so different about living through the evolution of technology, is you're seeing a whole bunch of things competing for prominence, and that to recognize that that's happened for virtually every technology. I think there's a lot of lessons to be drawn in there.
Yeah, definitely.
So what I think you were going to make another point on that.
Oh, I mean, another thing is just so I mean, in addition to kind of seeing the evolution of technology, I think just having a technical background, perhaps, and something of an engineer's mindset, leads me to it has me bring a somewhat different perspective to this. I find a lot of writing about the history of technology actually doesn't go very much into the technology itself.
Mhm.
And there are entire books about the history of a particular technology that barely, if at all, explain how the technology actually works. They spend a lot of time often on kind of the human drama surrounding the invention and patent battles and infighting and so on and so forth. And some of that is actually very interesting. But I'm really interested in like the technology itself. What was the problem? What was the technical challenge? How did the solution work? What were the technical merits of one solution over another? And so one of the things that I do when I go into this stuff is I go into it with a motivation and a goal and a determination to actually understand how the technology worked at some basic level, and then convey that understanding to my readers. I want to actually write in a way that makes it clear to a general audience, how some of this stuff works. I want to kind of demystify industrial civilization. That's a big goal of my work is, I think people might look out at might drive by a power plant or a substation and just see an incomprehensible crisscrossing of wires and and have no idea how is it that when I flip on a light switch, the light actually turns on. And so I want to kind of demystify some of that stuff and bring some basic level of understanding to people so that they feel that the world around them is actually something they can comprehend at some level.
Yeah, and as I think we'll get to, I think the demystification is intimately related to the appreciation. That
Yes.
is, I don't think that until you realize the difficulty that's involved in solving certain problems, whether it's like, how do you have a society of running water and sewage that doesn't just like sit in your backyard? Until you get the complexity and the challenges that had to be solved to do that, you can't actually appreciate it except in a kind of very abstract sort of way.
Yeah.
Um, Before we turn to that, though, I am curious about your experience being in Silicon Valley, and from two perspectives. One would be, what do you think are biggest misconceptions about what goes on in a place like Silicon Valley by that distort how people think about the current state of progress and innovation?
Hmm. Um, one of the biggest misconceptions I would say about innovation in general is the over focus on kind of on a single moment. Um, Sometimes there's a focus on the moment of inception, like you had some brilliant idea in the beginning, and that just kind of like set the course of the entire, development of a business or a technology. Um, a slightly different one is kind of maybe the idea that there's some, maybe in the middle of it there's some aha breakthrough, or maybe the idea that when a technology is first launched to the public there's some big publicity event, and that kind of sets the is a make or break. The reality is that there are very few kind of individual make or break moments. It's almost impossible for there to be a single make moment, as in like one moment where you just get that right and everything else doesn't matter. It's really, what really matters is the sort of unglamorous daily execution and just iteration and the grind over many years to to take something from very initial conception all the way through to a working technology, to a marketable product, to a profitable business. Like that is just that's just a very long iterative process, and it's more about kind of showing up every day and just consistently doing the work day after day over many, many years, rather than it is sort of captured in any one moment.
See, and I actually think that is a really important lesson for people to know. I think it goes to your point about demystification, because if we view creativity and innovation as a single aha moment where you see the future and that basically is the act of creation, then very few people can imagine themselves being in that role. Or you often hear like, I'm just waiting for my big idea. Whereas if you view it as kind of craftsmanship over time to solve a series of difficult problems, that's much more, yeah, I could see myself doing that. And you can attract a much wider set of problem solvers to it.
Yeah, I think we see this sort of thing in the history of invention. When you look at any kind of invention, any major invention that that everybody knows or that really affected an industry, you virtually always see, if you look at the history, that the person who kind of gets credit for inventing the thing was rarely the first inventor on record. They were rarely the first patent, for instance. So, I mean, classically, like before Edison's light bulb, there were, I think, dozens of other, patents on light bulb designs. I've been researching agricultural mechanization recently, and one of the watershed inventions there was the mechanical reaper for reaping wheat. And again, the reapers that sort of were successful and made the history books are not, I mean, there were dozens of patents, beforehand, and you virtually always find this. And so I think the key thing to understand about this is it's not just having the idea, for a light bulb, right? Oh, maybe we could make a light, work somehow with electricity, right? It's not even having the idea, oh, it needs to be a glass bulb and it needs to have some sort of a filament, et cetera. It's actually iterating until the thing becomes practical. Like the difference between Edison's bulb and the previous bulbs was it actually lasted for many hours and it was cheap enough to produce, right? Pretty much all the previous bulbs had a problem with one or both of those. Either they had like a platinum filament, and so they were super expensive, and or they just burned out really quickly. And so, it's funny. You'll sometimes hear, read in a history book or something. So and so invented the first practical X, right? Like maybe Edison invented the first practical light bulb. I think that's actually a redundancy. Inventing a thing is inventing a practical thing. If you invented a non-practical thing, all you have is kind of a proof of concept, a demonstration, a prototype. That can be valuable. But the thing that really makes the difference and gets an industry going is when you have a practical, kind of working, reliable, affordable version of a thing. And it's often the reliability and the affordability, again, those kind of like unglamorous details that are just come from long iteration. Those are the things that often, make the difference between an invention that was not taking off at all and then one that actually took off and created an industry.
Yeah, I mean, we'll often read, stories about or, hear rumors. This happens all the time in energy, like people who rush and say, like, no, there's going to be this amazing future where we use like, the leftover waste from producing beer in order to power civilization. And then you never hear from it again. And it's because something that can work technically in the sense of like you could make a prototype doesn't necessarily fulfill these other features. Like the world's not drinking enough beer such that the byproducts can resupply do what oil does, for instance. And so
Right.
I think that's a really important point, that when we think about innovation, is not thinking about like a single product that has the engineering capability to fulfill a goal, but the ability to actually create an affordable, scalable solution to a widespread problem.
Yeah. And so I mentioned reliability and affordability, which are two of those key kind of unglamorous attributes that practical inventions have to have. You mentioned another one for industrial processes, which is scalability, right? Sometimes you can get something working on a small scale, but it doesn't work on a large scale, or more work needs to be done to scale it up. And that's crucial.
So when you started thinking about progress more as the focus of your work, how did you start? How did you dive in? Because I know a lot of people, and hopefully a lot of people listening to this, they become fascinated by the topic, but I mean, in the end, there's an overwhelming amount of stuff to learn, and that's part of what makes it exciting. But how did you yourself get started? And I know that, I mean, you had always been interested in these kinds of issues, so I'm guessing you had somewhat of a foundation to build on. But did you have kind of a conscious method of approach, or was it just diving in wherever you happen to become interested?
Yeah. You're right that there's an enormous amount of material out there, and that's kind of why, in a sense, that's why I have a job, because I'm going to go out there and read hundreds of books in order to distill them down to one book that I'm writing, but also, maybe a short list of things that people should really read. Um, in terms of how it began for me and how I got started, honestly, it began as a hobby, or a side project, and then it kind of grew into an obsession, and then from there it became my full-time work. It actually even literally it began even smaller. It began as a reading list. It was literally just, what books am I going to read next? And I decided that I was interested in the Industrial Revolution and kind of have more broadly the history of human progress. And so I just started picking up books that seemed relevant. But I picked up a book that was titled something like A Brief History of How the Industrial Revolution Changed the World. Okay, here's a fairly good, seems like it's a one volume summary, and it's going to maybe cover kind of all the relevant times and places, and maybe I'll get a good overview of the Industrial Revolution this way. And the problem is, the book really felt like a grab bag of topics. It didn't give me what I felt was a big picture. It didn't give me an overarching kind of integrated story. It just gave me a series of vignettes. And I find that this is typically, this is the challenge with this reading. Either you'll get a deep dive on one topic, which can be very informative, but again, narrow, or you'll get a grab bag of isolated, kind of disconnected topics or loosely connected topics, selected seemingly at random, and you don't really walk away with the big picture. Again, either can be entertaining, either of those can be informative. But if you're really looking to, and if you're saying like, I want to understand what was the Industrial Revolution, and that really was a significant part of what I was going in to this with. I literally just wanted to know, what was it? Like, I knew that this thing called the Industrial Revolution happened, but my understanding of what it actually consisted of was, it was effectively, I think it was the time with like some steam engines and trains and coal. There was a lot of coal, and I don't know what else, right? That was kind of like the level that I understood it. So, I wanted a much deeper and broader and more thorough and more integrated picture. So yeah, I just started reading books, and then I would pick things up, just search for titles that seemed relevant. I would pick things up. One book that I read early on that influenced me was by Joel Mokyr, an economic historian. He wrote an article in The Atlantic that I ran across early in this effort, which ran under the headline "Progress Isn't Natural," and it was the article was about how the very idea of progress is actually a modern concept. And it was not the norm for most of human history. The idea of progress itself had to evolve, and progress wasn't going to happen until we resolved to bring it about. And that was such an intriguing concept that I went and read the book. And it was really reading that book that broadened the goal of my effort from just the Industrial Revolution to kind of like human progress as such.
Yeah, and I wonder how expansively you take that, and then how broadly you think other people who are interested in progress and kind of driving what's a growing progress movement think about it, because we typically think about it today as technology, or maybe if it's more expansive, kind of technology and science. But certainly when people were really starting to coalesce historically around the idea of progress, it was thought really to involve every aspect of humanity, from education to even ethics. And sometimes it was problematic because it was very kind of authoritarian, collectivistic, we'll make the new man. But it was a view of human life in all of its components getting better. And I'm curious as to how you think about the sort of contours and limits of what you're interested in, what you think the modern progress movement is interested in.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Overall, I see progress as having three main strands, but they're really interwoven and ultimately inseparable. One is the part that I've mostly been focusing on so far, which is material progress, kind of technological, economic, industrial progress. Two is the progress in science, and more broadly, the growth and distribution of knowledge. And then third is moral, social, or political progress. And so I think there has been significant progress in all three of those areas. And I also think that ultimately they all reinforce each other and depend on each other. And so history of science and the nature of and history of moral and social progress are other topics I'm definitely interested in digging into in the future.
So I want to turn to just attitudes towards progress, and what's your sense of kind of where we are, present day Western societies, broadly understood, in terms of attitudes towards progress?
Yeah. Well, let me back up and sort of set the historical context. I think if you turn back the clock to certainly the late 19th century, say around 1890s or so, the world, at least the Western world, was very pro progress, or very optimistic. They saw certainly the march of science and technology as this thing that was moving forward, was moving the world forward. Alfred Russel Wallace, who is one of the guys who worked on the evolutionary theory, and actually I think co-authored some stuff with Darwin. Wallace wrote this book called The Wonderful Century around the end of the 1800s. It was about the 1800s, and he sort of made the claim that more fundamental advances had been made in the 1800s than in all of the rest of human history beforehand. And so people were very optimistic. They saw this as going, and some of them kind of naively so, I would say. They saw this progress as going forward with no appreciable risks or problems. And indeed, they saw all of these types of progress as going hand in hand. So they were optimistic about moral progress at the same time as scientific and technological progress. And indeed, they saw them as as going together, in that people in the late 19th and even into the very early 20th century were looking around at the expansion of industry, the growth of trade between nations, and they thought that perhaps this would lead to the end of war. And that, in the beginning of the 1900s, they thought perhaps we are entering a new era of global peace. Of course, they were very wrong. And when the world wars came along, I think they really drove home a very painful lesson, a number of lessons, but one of them was that technology had not led to an end to war. In fact, it had made war all the more horrific and damaging and deadly. And, the big, fat, horrible exclamation point on the end of that entire period, of course, was the introduction of the atomic bomb. The most horrific weapon that the world had ever seen. And it was very clearly the product of modern science, modern technology, and modern industrial processes and capability. And so I think after the world wars, there was something of a reckoning. I think there was a shock to the system. I think it was a challenge, really, to anybody who believed in progress. Those 3 decades or so of the world wars were a deep challenge that I think people really didn't know how to answer. And around that time, also a lot of other concerns were coming to the fore. Old concerns about automation and job loss and job security, concerns about the growth and concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals, which was something that people felt they had fought when they had fought for republicanism against monarchy and aristocracy. And now they were seeing, in a sense, some people were worried that they were seeing, in a sense, a new aristocracy in the rise of the industrialists. And then there were new concerns as well, such as concerns about the environment, and the conservationist movement of the early 20th century was morphing into the environmentalist movement of the mid to late 20th century. And so all these concerns kind of came to the fore. And my hypothesis is that essentially what happened after the world wars is that the strongest advocates of progress became, were shaken, and became less certain, less vocal, and less apt to just sort of step forward and defend progress and their views. And some of the reactionary kind of anti-progress forces and ideas, which had always been around, but they'd been sort of lurking in the background, and they had not been ascendant because progress seemed to be working so well. And so I think in the mid 20th century, when we kind of encountered these challenges to progress, this evidence that maybe it wasn't working as well as we thought, I think this reactionary mode kind of came to the fore, and we got the rise of kind of the counterculture and of the radical environmentalist movement of the 60s and into the 70s. And what happened was, I think the West, at least in the 20th century, kind of turned away from progress, and in my opinion, sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater. We became kind of deeply fearful and suspicious of progress, and worried that it wasn't taking us where we wanted to go. And I think that's still where we are today, except now I think what's happening is we're looking back on the last 50, 60, 70 years and realizing that actually they haven't been as great. In particular, there's this hypothesis that's much discussed, and that I've come around to being quite sympathetic to, that the last 50 years have really seen a lot less progress in technology and industry and overall economic growth than we saw in the previous period, like the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think essentially we are reaping the fruits of an anti-progress worldview. And so, in my opinion, it's time to rescue the baby from the bathwater. We need a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century, something that is going to actually confront head on the challenges and the problems of progress, the very real risks and problems and all the things that people kind of maybe couldn't quite grapple with in the 20th century. I don't want to go back to the late 19th century kind of naive optimism. I do think it was a little bit naive. But let's actually kind of confront the problems of progress and solve them with more progress, and not throw out the very concept of moving forward and making the world better and making everybody's lives better. That's what I think we need to do to move forward in this century.
Yeah, it's I can't say it's surprising to me, but it's certainly notable how there's often kind of a false alternative painted, right? Like one side views progress as like, no, it's good. And therefore we don't have to think about risks and negatives. And the other side is, no, we have to think about risks and negatives. So it's bad. And we need to be very skeptical and hesitant and so on. What do you think is required? And I'm sure this would ultimately require a whole book or course, but at least what's your kind of framework for thinking about how we should approach progress with an awareness of the potential pitfalls and negatives, and yet a commitment to reaping the benefits and using progress to mitigate its own downsides?
Yeah. I think we need to be of the mindset that problems are real and solutions are also real, or at least possible. And so we need to acknowledge problems and at the same time look for solutions. This sounds obvious, but I think as you just kind of pointed out, like a lot of people fail at one or the other of those, right? So either they see the problems and they're so there's sort of a false dichotomy here between optimism and pessimism, in that some people are so, quote unquote, optimistic that they don't even want to acknowledge that problems exist, or there's anything to work on or solve, or that there are any kind of risks. And that's not even really optimism, right? Like a better term for that is complacency, or just dismissing the problems or blind to them. But then on the flip side, we have people who are so, quote unquote, pessimistic that they don't even want to acknowledge the existence of solutions, and any solution that comes up is kind of instantly dismissed. And that isn't even, that's even going beyond pessimism. That's really defeatism. So, we don't want to be complacent. We also don't want to be defeatist. I think the alternative is to be, let's just call it solutionist, right? Acknowledge the problems and then look for solutions. And so I think that's what we need to do. And I think you see a lot of people ignoring one side or the other, the optimists kind of digging in their heels and refusing to even acknowledge, the existence of problems, and then the pessimists refusing to acknowledge when there might be a solution. So just, be a realist and kind of acknowledge both sides. That's the way to sort of fully acknowledge the reality of the situation.
I think one thing that makes it hard is that often the solutions, we typically think about solutions almost as like little central planners, like, okay, tell me what the solution is going to be. And often the solutions are discovered, right? And so we have a discovery process that undertakes. I think a lot about what, like, social media, right? Social media kind of comes out, and in general, people have this view of, oh, this is great, we're finally all connected. And then certain real problems started to emerge, such as like people becoming addicted to it and using it more than they wanted to, online bullying, privacy concerns, all sorts of concerns that I think have at least elements of, yeah, these are real issues that one would have to pay attention to. And so if you would ask people at the stage of, once they become very aware of the problems, part of what happens is they take for granted the benefits. So they don't even think about those. They no longer think about, well, we really want to preserve this unique ability to connect, and instead become very focused on the negatives. And yet if you ask, all right, well, what are the solutions to these? I mean, some of them are obvious, though they more rest with individual responsibility, but others are, I think, have to be discovered over time. Twitter just announced that they're going to be coming out with some tools that they're going to play with that can help a person, like, detag themselves to kind of take them out of a, online mob situation and so on. And I think that if you're telling people, in effect, we should be solution focused, but the solutions aren't yet on the table, or at least many of them aren't on the table, it's it's a hard sell, though. I think it it's the only sell there is, and so I don't have a great handle on like how you make that case. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's domain specific. I think the problems and the solutions are unique to each domain. And so you just have to go in and actually kind of research each one. I don't know if there's a general, I don't know if there's a general kind of approach or, a blanket. There's certainly no formula to it, right? It's an art.
I mean, I guess part of it is what we're talking about here, which is if you have a context of appreciating progress and seeing the history of how solutions evolve. I mean, that's why I hold a general view that, yeah, we will figure out solutions, and it's not hot air because it's not based on, yeah, I know exactly what technology companies will do in social media, but I've seen in case after case historically this kind of process. And so it's, again, if we demystify what has actually happened in progress, I think it primes people to be in the solution premise rather than the what was your great word? You had complacency,
Yeah,
and
versus right, and complacency versus defeatism, right? And
versus a kind of defeatist sort of attitude towards these things.
yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, certainly, knowing your history can help, and finding historical analogies or just finding inspiration from the way people address things in the past. Knowing that so sometimes just knowing that things have been much worse and we've gotten through it, or or I don't know. I mean, finding okay, so I mean, as an example, genetic engineering. So in the 1970s, the recombinant DNA technology was invented, and we were able to, start basically tinkering with genetic codes in a major way for the first time. And some people started doing research, and there was a particular concern people were working with. As I recall, there was a simian virus that was known to be able to cause cancer in some organisms. And so there was this concern of like, okay, what if we modify this organism or this virus or something, and now we've got now we have a virus that could possibly escape, possibly infect humans, possibly cause cancer in humans, and things like this made people sort of legitimately worried. And so, okay, what did they do? Well, they didn't just ban genetic engineering, but at the same time, they also didn't just say, "Don't worry, it'll be fine," or "Hey, we can." They didn't just kind of like blindly go forward. They actually did call for a temporary moratorium on certain types of experiments, which researchers put out this call, and as to my understanding, it was heeded. And the moratorium was for just look. They said, "Hey, everybody, let's just stop for a little bit and let's plan a conference. Let's all get together and discuss safety measures. What are we going to do about this?" And so there was a period of something like 8 months where this moratorium lasted, and they finally did get together in 1975 at the sort of well-known conference at Asilomar, and they all, for a few days, they all talked about it. And ultimately, they came out with a fairly sensible solution, which was to define certain sort of safety levels of like, okay, let's assess how dangerous is the thing that we're working with. And then for each safety level, there was like a set of kind of appropriate measures that you would take at that safety level to, to make sure your experiment didn't turn into something horrible. And so, they walked out of that with a way forward, right? A way forward that was, within the context that they had, at least was kind of a responsible way to make progress. They were honoring both the need for progress and also the need for real safety when you're tinkering with something dangerous, right? So again, I feel like that's a great example of kind of looking at both sides, acknowledging both sides. And yeah, they actually did have a temporary moratorium on certain types of experiments. But it was temporary, and it was temporary until we find a solution, right? It wasn't just a kind of shut this door and lock it and place a sign on the entrance that says never go here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'd never heard about that before. So, if we have as the goal changing the cultures attitudes towards progress. I mean, one of the, I think, very exciting phenomenon that has played out over the last few years has been an increasing number of increasingly high profile people becoming very interested in this idea of progress. Indeed, that I think you can now meaningfully speak of a progress movement. How do you see that movement and sort of what it's, um, what the, you know, large scale agenda is for actually starting to enact, or not enact isn't the right way to put it, but have an impact such that we can get a healthier attitude towards progress?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the folks who kind of founded this movement, just to give listeners some context, Tyler Cowen, economist at George Mason and head of the Mercatus Center there, um, and Patrick Collison, the CEO of technology company Stripe. The two of them actually co-authored this article in The Atlantic a couple of years ago called "We Need a New Science of Progress," and that was where they coined the term progress studies. And that was sort of the moment that kicked off I would say, the progress community. Bunch of people sort of came together around this concept, started talking to each other about it, and so forth. And it wasn't long after that, actually, that I decided to go full time on this work. So yeah, a number of people are very interested in this. Where does it go next? Well, I think there's still a lot more intellectual work, a lot more thinking and speaking and writing to be done to flesh out what is this philosophy of progress and what are kind of its implications. I think we need a lot more history, and that's why what I mostly focus on is the history of progress. We just need to kind of we need a retelling of the story of industrial civilization. We need this stuff needs to be made more accessible to a broader audience. I mean, it's not as if the details are undiscovered. I think almost all the details are kind of out there, but they're scattered throughout writings of economic history and other disciplines. They're not consolidated into a form that can be kind of broadly impactful or accessible to any kind of a non-academic audience. So I think we need a lot more of that. I think we need many books sort of just exploring different areas of progress and kind of explaining how they came about and how we got the modern world. I also think we need real sort of solutions to problems facing the world today from a pro-progress perspective. Coming back to that, idea that there were sort of real challenges in the 20th century that, maybe the progress philosophy wasn't prepared to answer. I think we need to bring answers to them. What do we do about climate? What do we do about job loss and, or the upheaval in the job market caused by automation and technology? What do we do about pollution? What do we do about, et cetera? I mean, you sort of pick all of these things. We need actual analyses of these problems. What do we do about the risks of bioengineering? And the general risks of pandemics? What about the risk of nuclear war, or for that matter, nuclear radiation from other nuclear technologies like power energy? All of these things, need to be addressed one way or another. And you might say that, hey, this problem is smaller than people think. You might say it's bigger than people think, but for whatever, in whatever perspective, I think we need to address them and bring solutions. And then the third thing I think we need from an intellectual foundation perspective is we need more positive visions of the future. We need to paint a picture of the world that we are working towards. What is the world that we all want to live in? And I think there are very different sort of visions of what the future could be. Sometimes I think of it in terms of archetypes as like, who is the person who's bringing about the future that we want? Bill Gates or Elon Musk? So Gates is out there funding the fight against malaria and the fight against pandemics and so forth, and doing a lot of, frankly, he's doing a lot of really good work. But Elon Musk is out there, creating brain-computer interfaces and rockets that will colonize Mars and, so on and so forth. And so I think, one vision of the future is sort of like just a nicer version of the present where we eliminate disease and we eliminate poverty and so forth. But otherwise, things, sort of more or less look the same. In fact, maybe we even roll back a little bit of the progress to have a quote unquote sustainable future. And then there's another vision of the future that is much more kind of ambitious and expansive and technological, and it's more of a science fiction future. And I think we need to paint more. I'm sympathetic to the goals of, end poverty, end disease, and so forth. Those are all great goals for the future, but I really don't want to stop there. I really want us to keep moving forward and to keep creating. I mean, just as today is a science fiction future compared to 100 or 200 years ago, I think we should continue to create science fiction futures. They can be real. They don't have to be fiction. We can not only, cure cancer and heart disease, we can cure aging itself, right? We can colonize other planets, and who knows, maybe someday other solar systems. We can create these things that will just blow everybody's minds, and then quickly become the new normal, as the mind-blowing technologies have already become. So that is part of the work that I think, the intellectual work that I think the progress movement needs to do.
Here, let me know if I'm being naive. So this is one reason why I am very pro the progress movement, aside from the fact that I value progress, which is, I think it's, if you think about that kind of the state of politics, it's not a unique view to think that it's become very tribal, and that there's kind of like no cross communication and nobody can like find any common ground and whatnot. And I think one thing progress does is, I don't think it's owned by a tribe, and so it allows kind of a way to find a certain kind of common ground, which is, all right, whatever else is true, we want to really push ourselves as human beings to make the future much better, much faster than it is today. And so one of the things I see amongst people who are interested in progress is that there's people who you would put on the political left, people who you would put in the political right, libertarians. And there's a debate amongst them about, well, what really is going to drive progress here? What really are the biggest concerns we should be working on? But it's very different from kind of like the zero sum at each other throat game, because there's kind of a common vision that we're working towards. And it becomes much more of a viable, productive debate rather than a slash and burn kind of debate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like the most about the progress movement is that I think at its core, there is a shared positive value. There's like a thing that we all agree is kind of a basic good, and that we all want to work towards. And that does bring, it gets underneath politics in a certain sense. Really, one of the things that originally motivated me to start studying progress actually was seeing how political debates go, and seeing how much people are locked in sort of perpetual disagreement because not because they disagree on solutions to problems, because they actually disagree on kind of like what the basic problems are. So I mean, imagine, for instance, getting together like a left-wing kind of environmentalist with a right-wing deficit hawk. One of them thinks that climate change is the big issue of the day that's going to kill us all if we don't, act now and strongly. And then, the deficit hawk says, no, that's all overhyped. The actual thing that's going to kill us is the trillions of dollars in national debt. That's the thing that's nobody's paying attention to, And then if you imagine like a social justice activist enters the room, right, then they would say, no, you're both wrong. It's actually racial inequality that's going to tear our society apart if we don't. So these people don't even agree on what the problems are, right? They're never going to agree on solutions or priorities for society if they don't even agree on kind of what are the goals and values, and what are the risks and threats. And so, one of the reasons I started studying progress was because I realized that one of the things driving my goals and priorities is a very keen appreciation of the fact of progress, and the fact that a couple hundred years ago, life really sucked compared to today, and that we've come a long way. We've created an amazing standard of living. And, this notion that it doesn't have to end here, right? That progress isn't over, or it doesn't have to be, that we can keep going into the future, but also that that's not guaranteed, right? That progress isn't just some sort of like automatic or inevitable thing. It's really, it really depends on choice and effort. And so I think the great thing about the progress movement is it's bringing together people around this core, positive, shared goal and value, and to some extent the shared vision of the future, and giving us a basis for debate. So maybe one person thinks that a very libertarian or laissez-faire, hands-off kind of approach is the best for progress, and somebody else is more of a kind of progressive FDR, Vannevar Bush type who thinks that big, government programs and investment are the way to progress. Okay, well, they have a shared goal. How about, let's debate on that basis. Let's look at history. Let's look at economics. Let's look at data. Let's look at, can we actually figure out what has led to progress in the past, and what do we think is working now, and let's try things. So that is, I feel like a way to get underneath some of the political debates and have maybe a healthier and more interesting and more productive debate about, where do we want to go?
I was really intrigued when you kind of set out your kind of three areas where the progress movement, where we need work done, but particularly by the last. And I emphatically agree with you that visions of the future are crucial. And I wonder what you think, like, who are the people responsible for that, right? So on the one hand, there can be the kind of explicit futurists who they kind of write about, projecting out technology in the future. I think you'd probably say maybe it's like science fiction writers are another crucial one. And I'm not a huge science fiction consumer, but my sense is that at least in what gets put on screen, which I'm more aware of than what gets written in books, to the extent that it's mostly dystopian, and so the projections of the future are much more like Mad Max than they are Star Trek. And I wonder who you think are the kind of people who are engaging in this goal of helping us see the future, and what sorts of activities that would involve.
Yeah. I think you're right, though. There are futurists, or people who take on some sort of role, like just writing nonfiction about what kind of things we could have. One of my favorite entries that's at least partially in that genre recently is a book called "Where Is My Flying Car?" By J. Storrs Hall. I wrote a review of that on my website at The Roots of Progress. Absolutely agree that science fiction is a place where this happens. You mentioned Star Trek. Many engineers and scientists were inspired by Star Trek in their youth, and saw that as a future to work towards. Who else can play a part? I think that business leaders, so certainly founders of ambitious technology companies themselves, need to play a part in this. Somebody who does this very well is Blake Scholl of Boom Supersonic. One thing that Boom has done really well is just paint the future of what is it going to mean for all of our lives if we can travel to, twice as fast or faster. And it isn't just, it doesn't just stop at, well, you shave a couple hours off of a trip, right? It actually changes what trips you can take. It changes what kind of relationships you can have, both personal relationships and business relationships, right? It changes people's lives. And this is certainly true if you look at the history of transportation technology, and what happened when we got the first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. What happened when we got jet airplanes and could cross oceans, and so forth. So I think it's up to the people actually building the future to say what that future could be. I would say the same is true perhaps of scientists, right? So you look at the scientists who invented, say, CRISPR, like Jennifer Doudna, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Is one of the ones who was key. I think when a scientist invents a breakthrough technology like that, it's a great role for them to kind of help the world understand, where could this go? What could we do with this? What could be the benefits? There's always kind of a balancing act of painting a vision of the future without overhyping or overselling things, and certainly maybe setting people's expectations for how long it's going to take, because it's usually decades for these things to play out. But really, anybody who involved in creating the future can also help paint that future of paint that picture of where we want to go.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So, Jason, for people who are interested in learning more about progress, what are next steps they can take? And in particular, how can they follow what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So my website is rootsofprogress.org. You can read my writings there or subscribe to my email list. I'm also pretty active on Twitter, and my handle on Twitter is just my full name, Jason Crawford. So follow me there.
Yeah, and I encourage everybody to do it. I mean, I have read a bunch of these books, and I never fail to be intrigued and surprised by what Jason discovers with his much more fastidious search at seeking out of knowledge in this area. So highly recommended for everybody. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a good conversation.